Good morning, everybody. Again, as Rebecca said, my name is Aaron Ortiz. I work here at WGR Southwest. We're an environmental health and safety company. My job in particular is to help people with the industrial general stormwater permit. One of the things I notice is when I go to see people, they're like, especially newer businesses or businesses that have been around for a while, but for whatever reason flew underneath the radar, and they didn't have general permit coverage, and all of a sudden the water board or someone says, "Hey, you don't have permit coverage," and they're like, "What happened? What's this all about?" So we're going to go a little bit about just a little history. What's this all about, and then some of the tenets of the general permit, and then in part two we're going to talk about what the permit expects you to do, and that's important. First, let's talk about where the permit comes from and what's some of the things that are in it. First, so businesses find that they're required to acquire general coverage, and basically that's what we're going to talk about. So let's do a little bit of historical background first. Okay, the question is, why are we here? Okay, in 1948, the federal government saw there's a lot of pollution, and so they enacted the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. Okay, and they were in the way trying to get the waterways of the United States, because after World War II, I've done a lot of research, and it's kind of fun for me to do this. But after World War II, production and things started really growing, and people were just dumping all types of things into the rivers, and basically there was no real controls, and it was causing some serious problem with the waterways. It's very famous just how much mess the waters were. And so some folks were trying to get laws enacted, but there were a lot of people who just didn't care, and they couldn't get a lot of traction in getting it done. So if you look at my background, you'll see it looks like a tugboat in fire. That picture came from 1952 off the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, and Cleveland, Ohio. And what happened was there was so much sludge and so much garbage in the water that the river, or should I say the sludge floated on the river, would keep catching fire. And it didn't take much. I mean, a spark would ignite the fire. And so what we have here, we show a picture of a tugboat and how they're pumping water from one side of the river onto the other side of the river to try to put out the fire. I read a quote, and in fact, if you saw the keynote yesterday, I had some pictures, some pretty disturbing pictures of just people dipping their hand in the Cuyahoga and coming up, and their hands completely covered in sludge. And I read quotes where people said that basically, if you work over the Cuyahoga River and you fall in, you're probably going to die because you're going to get smothered in the sludge in the water. So what happened was, you had a series of fires in the Cuyahoga River. They've been going on for the last 100 years, well over 10. Some sites say as much as 13 or more fires that were started. And there was a new mayor in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, and he's been trying to get the Cuyahoga River clean. So what happened was on June of 1969, once again, the Cuyahoga River caught fire. And the next day, he created a press conference, come out there and say, the fire only lasted half an hour. It actually wasn't so, in fact, it was so short-lived and so quick that they didn't get pictures of it. These pictures that you see on the screen are from, 13 years earlier. So, or 16 years earlier. So what happened was, he showed that, look, there's a problem here and we need to fix it. And what happened was, earlier in the year, off of Santa Barbara, there was a major blowout from an oil platform, kind of like we saw with the New Horizons and the Gulf Coast a few years ago, that caused a lot of pollution off of Santa Barbara. So that got people thinking a lot more than the Cuyahoga River. And basically after that, people were like, we need to do something about this. So in 1972, they revised the Federal Clean Water Control Act, and it became the Clean Water Act. And from the Clean Water Act, some things that came from that, and some things that came from all the things, was eventually we got the EPA that was developed. Actually, it was amended under President Nixon, that the EPA, and he actually was the first one to appoint the director for the EPA. Also, they created the MPDS programs under the Clean Water Act. MPDS is to regulate water, or the waters of the United States. In the late 1980s, they found that while they were controlling water pollution, it was doing a good job. It still needed a lot more work. So they amended the Clean Water Act in 1987 and established a framework to where they could have a partnership with cities, or rather partnership with states, to help control pollutants. And they created the General Permit Program. And the General Permit Program says, look, we have a general set of rules, okay, that apply to everybody in the state. Or in this case, initially, it was the federal government's version, which they call the multi-sector. Sector being landfills, manufacturing, transportation. Those are different business sectors. And so there are different types of businesses. Some of these businesses we think have a higher chance of polluting the water. As they saw with the Cuyahoga River, where steel mills and paper mills and things were just dumping all types of garbage into the water. Same thing. So they have this program they created. It was called the Standard Industrial Classification Code, and it created 4-digit numbers. And under this coding, they describe what businesses do. And what they said was, if you're in this category, for example, transportation would be the 4000s category. If you're in this category, if your industrial activity meets these numbers, you have to get permission to let water leave your property. You can't just let stormwater or any water leave now. You have to have controls, best management practices, which we'll talk about. And they created the General Permit Program and said, look, we created this multi-sector permit that has rules for water leaving your property. However, states, we're partnering with you. So if you want to take over this program, so instead of having this fiat from the federal government running it, you can get permission from us to run the program. So in '89, California was able to get the General Permit Program transferred to them for their administration. So what we have is we have a industrial general stormwater permit issued by California. However, it's got federal Clean Water Act authority behind it. Okay, so that's where we're at. So you have the MPDS program way back from '72, revised in '87. Basically, they're saying businesses that have SIC codes that are listed in their industrial activity in this general permit requirements, you have to follow the rules. You have to make sure that water just doesn't leave. You can't just let water leave now. You got to put controls in place. You have to have permit coverage. So the MPDS program created an industrial general stormwater permit, which we call the IGP or general permit, which basically says you now have this set of rules. California's permit is a lot like the general permit or the multi-sector permit from the federal. Now, here's the thing. The federal government says, okay, California, in this particular case, now that you have permit coverage, you can administer your permit, but make sure that your general permit is as stringent or more stringent than ours, not less. So we have a permit. It's very, very similar to the multi-sector permit that the federal government has, but it also is different. And so, for example, years ago, pH wasn't as considered as critical in terms of time factors. So years ago, California would say, well, as long as you turn in your results and have the lab process your pH, you're fine. But in 2015, the federal government's their version of that said, no, you have to have pH tested within 15 minutes of collecting your sample. So in 2015, when the California really revised their permit that they'd had from 1987, they revised it and said, okay, from now on, pH has to be tested within 15 minutes of collecting your sample. Why? Because the federal government made things more stringent, so we had to follow in California. So that revised version, the version that we pretty much have today, it's got some serious amendments, which we'll talk about, but for the most part, was basically put into effect as of July 1st of 2015. And then there were amendments that were back in 2018 adopted on November 6, 2018, and then enacted or came into effect as of July 1st, 2020. Okay. So online, when you want to look at the permit, you'll see unofficial draft posted across the permit. That is the enforceable general permit we have under today. The reason they don't have an official draft out there is because they need to assign a permit number to it, which for whatever reason hasn't been assigned to it yet. They said that basically the order number hasn't received, so it's an order number, which it's more of an administrative thing than anything else. So again, it may be saying unofficial draft online, but that is the enforceable permit. It is the law of the land in California as of July 1st, 2020. So here is your current permit that we're under. As you can see, the unofficial draft, scroll the product. Now, what we're going to talk about, and here's where we're going to hone in of this permit. Remember, I told you it's got general rules and you fit. Well, the reason I'm talking about these is because, as you see in Section 10 and 11, what you do is you create a stormwater pollution prevention plan, or SWEP as we call it, and the SWEP tells everybody, okay, here's the general rules, and here's how we intend to apply those general rules to us. Okay, so they're prescriptive to a point, but then they're broad enough that you can apply them slightly differently. And the whole point of your SWEP is not to just copy. I've seen this a lot in some SWEPs where basically all they do is they copy the general permit, slap it into a binder, and say, here it is. We'll get into it in a minute, but for example, you have one of the best management practices, or BMPs, which we'll talk about, is good housekeeping. And so what they do is, if the permit says you need to do good housekeeping, it kind of describes what they mean by good housekeeping, different nuances of it. And what they say is, well, there's something that says, well, we do good housekeeping. Okay, what does it mean? Do you sweep? Do you have a vac truck? Do you capture, if you hose down your yard and capture that water and reuse it? What do you mean by good housekeeping? Well, we do good housekeeping. Well, that's not very helpful. The whole point is you say we do good housekeeping, and here's how we do good housekeeping. So one of my things about good SWEP is, does the SWEP actually tell you what they're doing, or does it just regurgitate what's on this in the general permit? So we're going to talk about in the two one we're going to talk about in this one. Basically, we're going to focus on Section 10 of the general permit, which is the SWEP binder, the what's in the permit section, and then Section 2 we're going to talk about the monitoring. So best management practices. Okay, this you're going to hear all the time as from now on, because that's what they refer to. BMPs. Okay, this is a structured description we have from the glossary, attachment C of the general permit. Scheduling of activities, prohibitions of practices, maintenance procedures, and other management practices to prevent or reduce the discharge of pollutants. BMPs also include treatment requirements, operating procedures, and practices to control site runoff, spillage, leaks, sludge of waste disposal, and drainage from raw material storage. Okay, now let's translate this into English, shall we? So, in other words, anything you do or practice, or anything you build to reduce or eliminate pollutants in stormwater is a BMP. So I personally am partial to my definition a little more. Why? So a BMP is a very broad term. If you fuel something on your site and you put a drop pan underneath it to capture it, that's a BMP. If you, in that fueling, if you're required to have person on site during the activity, if they're required to do some things to help reduce drips or things from hitting the ground, that's a BMP. If you build a cover over something, or you put it, and then, for example, if you see you have a hazardous waste thing where it's covered in the shed and you have it so that it's got secondary containment, that's all BMPs. Okay, so BMPs are anything you do or practice, or anything that you build to reduce or eliminate pollutants in stormwater. Very broad term. And what you'll find is many people are like, well, if I'm doing this and this, you'll find that a lot of the practices you do that are required by, for example, Cal OSHA, some of the practices, some of the requirements to meet Cal OSHA, in a sense, are BMPs that you're doing already. So basically, all you're really doing is you're keeping the place clean, you're doing different things, and you're taking some of the requirements from other regulatory bodies and basically using those with the name BMP on it. So you'll find that a lot of things the permit will cover, which we're talking about, the permit will require, you're actually already doing a lot of them probably. And so there's two types of BMPs, which I mentioned earlier. One is the minimum BMPs. These are the ones that are non-structural in general. And then you have advanced BMPs, which are ones that are structural and are things that you build. Okay, the general permit, the Clean Water Act. So remember, we're all the way back to the Clean Water Act, the federal one, passed down to the general permits we have here in the state. It requires that you're supposed to put into place BMPs to the extent feasible. Now that language extent feasible was really pushed on by people who were under the general permit when they were doing it, because it's not always reasonable or feasible for a business to do certain BMPs. And so if they say you have to do this, and you say, well, that may be well and good, but given our certain situation, that's not possible for us. One of the things the Water Board loves to see is that people can capture their water. In fact, if you watch our keynote yesterday about inspections, the regulator, Rich Mall and Lowell Cottle, they kind of touched on this quite a bit, talking about if you can capture your water and let it soak under the ground, if it works, that's really good BMP. Why? Because they want to restore the water table. They want to keep water from just leaving property, so that way you don't have pollutants washing off. But a lot of facilities just don't have that capability. I have a former client that sits in the middle of an industrial park surrounded by businesses. There's no way they can build a pond. Everything's paved. Their businesses are very hard to differentiate what their water is from other people's water. So again, it's not always feasible to do certain things, and so that's why they put that in there. So the permit has certain BMPs that are mandatory, the non-structural ones. Minimum BMPs consist of mostly non-structural practices under the current permit. They're required to apply each facility. So to the extent feasible, remember that language is going to come in handy. To the extent feasible, you have to do this. So that's why, again, like I said, with your SWEP's going to say, here's the BMP that we're required to do. According to the general permit, the general rules, we have good housekeeping we have to do. And here's how we do it. Okay? So you are required to implement and maintain to the extent feasible minimum BMPs to reduce pollutants. Okay. So so we were talking about this. Well, I already touched on this. So basically, we're basically saying, hey, some businesses were saying, when they were developing the permit that came out in 2015 and like 2012 and 2013 and discussions there, basically they were saying, look, there are some BMPs that just are not feasible for us to do. So that is why they added this language. This language is actually here to help you, so you can make the argument, hey, it's not feasible for me to do this. So in other words, you must implement the minimum BMPs that needs to meet with what your industry is doing in general and what is technologically and economically achievable. So I call this the build a better mousetrap thing. Basically what you're saying is, look, they're not expecting you to have the USS Enterprise come down from outer space, land on your property and clean your water. Well, that's not technologically, it's not feasible at all. But you can sweep, you can cover things, you can redirect water away from stockpiles. There are things you can do, and that's what they're saying. You're expected to do things that your industry does. So for example, let's say I'm a certain type of industry, I'm a recycler, and another recycler has discharges and their water's fine, and my water has issues. Well, they're going to say, okay, well, what's that other recycler doing? They've raised the bar, so now you have to do it. So it's kind of like grading on a curve. I know a lot of guys hate teachers who grade on a curve. If the class has a bunch of A students, they're kind of ruining the curve for all the rest of us C students. So that's kind of the point. The whole point is, it's grading on the curve. If there's a new technology that comes out and it's economically achievable and people are employing it and it's working, then you're going to be expected to do that. There's a principle in the general permit called BAT, BCT. If you're writing something down, this might be a good place to write something down, because this is a principle throughout the permit. BAT, best available technology, economically achievable. BCT, best conventional control pollutant technologies. The BAT, BCT basically says, look, if you have issues with your water, you need to keep applying BMPs, both advanced or minimal or advanced, until you achieve the water quality goals that the Water Board wants for you. So you have to keep applying technologies. You have to keep applying it. So many years ago, when the permits first started coming out in 1992, people say, hey, we grab samples, it shows that our water has issues. So we did a lot more sweeping. Okay. And that was good enough back then. But the bar has been raised since then. So now basically you're going to say, well, that's good, but apparently you still need more work. And so it's a step-by-step, or what the old permit used to refer to as an iterative process, a step-by-step process. Right now, you're basically saying, hey, this is what we can do. And then you do what you can. And that's why that language I talked about earlier about extent feasible comes in, Because, for example, if some things are not feasible for you to do, and your water is still not to the standards the water board wants, if you can show that you're doing everything you can to the extent feasible, which economically is achievable for you, that's all you can do. So let's talk about the minimum required BMPs. The first of all, the non-structural ones. As I mentioned earlier, good housekeeping. Now, the old permit that was in '97, it was about this thick. The new one came out, it's over 208 pages. One of the reasons is because a lot of people misunderstood a lot of things, and so they took more time in this permit to describe what they mean by what they say in the general permit. What you find, I find in my business, is I start to speak in consultantese rather than English, where because I'm so used to working with the permit and with regulatory bodies and with people who are in the industry, we use our terminologies, and sometimes we forget that terminologies we completely understand and have no problem with. Our terminologies aren't used in the general public, and so people are left behind. So I like to try to break things down into a more common understanding. So that way, like me, when I started back in 2007, I had no clue about stormwater. I had no clue about any of this stuff. I've learned over time. So I realized we need to make sure that we're communicating better to people who are being regulated, you. And so that's why I like to break things down. And the permit had that in mind as well. That's why when they came out with the new version in 2015, and then has of course been revised as of 2020, is they expanded a lot of the explanations so that people have a better understanding of what they mean by what they say. So good housekeeping is observe all outside industrial areas, including potential pollutants from offsite sources, for anything that might affect stormwater discharges, to determine how best to clean the areas. Now, remember I told you they give you general rules, okay? And so if you notice, it says sweeping frequency, power washing, etc. All that stuff is up to you. If you do some stuff and your water numbers are fine, then you're meeting that BAT, BCT expectation, okay? If you're doing good housekeeping and the water comes back and it's not so good, well, then you need to do more. And that's why BAT, BCT said, look, you grab samples, your water does not meet our targets, therefore you need to do more. Now, here's one thing I love about not love, but I like a lot about the permit, which there's other things coming down, especially right now it's in effect down in Southern California. But up here in the Central Valley, where I'm located, we don't have something called NELs yet. So we'll talk about that later. But what we do have is NALs, numeric action levels. And these are targets, these are things. And what I love about this permit, at least in one part, is it doesn't just slap you down if you find numbers. The whole point is if you grab a sample, which we'll talk about in part 2, and your samples are over the targets that the water board wants for you, you're not in trouble with the permit. You're not out of compliance with the permit, as long as you take the steps to address the problems and try to fix them. And if you try to fix them and not quite yet, well, then BAT, BCT says you got to keep adding more. So, okay, still follow the steps, still do what you need to do. And that's what I like. I like, rather than saying, oh, we found an issue, slap, let's give them a fine and let's punish them. How about the way the NAL system works is, you find a problem, okay, let's see what we can do to make it better. Okay, to me, that's a much better approach. Personal opinion. So what's encapsulated in good housekeeping? Minimizing track out, in other words, keep stuff from inside getting outside. Minimize dust generation. People say, hey, all that stuff was undercover, but yet they create all these plumes of dust and all the pollutants that land outside and it goes out the storm drain. Remember, some of these standards are really pretty low. For example, copper. The numeric action level for copper is 0.0332 parts per million, or milligrams per liter. Okay, that's really low. And so if you generate stuff in dust, and even a little bit of dust that puffs outside and lands on the ground and the stormwater washes it down, it can bring you above that NEL standard. Make sure that exposed equipment or vehicle washing areas are cleaned. So if you wash stuff outside, the permit now says that you have to clean up after yourself. If you have outside washing areas where you wash equipment or whatever, when you're done, you're required to, you just can't leave it and then let the rain wash it off. They say, well, some people say, hey, this area is clean. We don't have to, it just dries, it sits there and dries. We don't have to do anything with it. Well, that's true until we had a year like we had earlier this year, where at the beginning of 2023, we had some serious rains. I mean, extreme rain events. that anything and everything that never used to discharge before was discharged. I had clients who hadn't discharged for years because they have ponds, and all of a sudden they're like, we got to grab a sample. Half the people didn't know how to do it because they haven't done it for so long because their ponds are always big enough. So, what they're saying is, if you have an area where you're doing outside cleaning, you got to make sure that when you're done washing or cleaning, that you clean up after yourself. You can't just leave all the junk on the ground. Cover all stored materials that might mobilize pollutants during a storm event, which makes sense. Contain all non-solid materials, particulates, powders, shredded paper that might be blown. I used to know a place that where when the wind would blow, they used to have a lot of shredded paper, and the paper would go cut up, and you could see it flying way up in the air and just basically distributing all over the area. Well, what they did was they started putting in some hosing, and whenever they would have shredded paper outside, even though they baled it, it was still some shredded paper was escaping. They would hose it down just to keep it from doing that. Prevent wash water from getting into the storm drain runoff. Okay, yes, that's a good BMP, but it's also illegal. If you wash off materials that goes down the storm drain, that's an illicit discharge and you can get in trouble. So yes, it's a BMP, but yes, also you don't want to get in trouble. Minimize authorized non-storm water discharges. Okay, and we'll talk about it. There's a saying, and for the most part it's true, only rain down the drain. And while that's primarily true, the general permit allows for certain non-storm water to go down the storm drain. Okay, so this non-storm water going down the storm drain, but has to leave relatively clean, and we'll talk about that. Okay, but there is certain types of water like irrigation, and we'll talk about that, that's allowed to go down the storm drain as long as it leaves relatively clean. Preventative maintenance. So we have one. We had good housekeeping. Now we move into preventative maintenance. Okay. The whole point of preventive maintenance is twofold. One, you're required to do preventive maintenance on your best management practices, your BMPs, which we talked about. So if you have BMPs, you should keep them in good shape as required by the general permit. But also your equipment. So if you have equipment outside, if you don't take care of it, it's going to break down. So one of the things the permit does is says, hey, identify and determine. By the way, you'll find that the permit wants people to think through the process. They want people to think through what they're doing. So you'll find things like determine, make a procedure, identify. They want people to actually think. People just get this book. They had a permit years ago. They got this binder. They stick it on the shelf and they walk away. Well, that's not thinking through your process. They want water to stay clean. So that's why they want you to go outside and determine all stationary facility and mobile equipment systems that could spill or cause a leak. Okay. They're not saying, if an asteroid comes from outer space and hit, no, reasonable stuff. Like if we drive forklifts through here, are they going to poke something? Or if we have this, is this going to cause a problem? Okay. So, or we have a piece of machinery outside. If this machinery isn't maintained, it can break open. I have a former client where he had a bunch of forklifts that were very old, and his idea of taking care of the equipment was when the hydraulic hoses would bust, you put duct tape on it and get to it later. So not a good idea, especially in terms of calibration issues. So basically, a new manager had come from outside, and he go, "Oh, this is completely unacceptable." So what he did was he had a service come out, service all the forklifts they had on their facility, which was quite a few. All of them are pretty dated too. That's why you had hydraulic oil just all over the place. And then he put them on a regularly scheduled maintenance program. And so there was an initial cost to that, but it was worth it. Their yard is much cleaner. Their numbers are looking much better. And overall, it was the right move. And now they have regular maintenance. So preventive maintenance, that's the example of good preventive maintenance. Determine what can happen that may cause a leak, perform appropriate scheduled maintenance, and that's what he did. And then there it is, develop procedures. Why do you want to develop procedures? So that way, anybody who moves on, any new hires, anybody else who comes, they actually have written instructions, what's expected of them. Because many times I find in facilities, I show up and half the staff has retired out, after 30 years, they were working, they retire out. And the new guys come in and they're like, well, what's your spill kits? Well, how do you do this? Oh, well, we do this. Okay. They don't know what they're doing. So having a written procedure, if you take the time, will really help anybody who comes on board will actually have a process they can follow that's been proven to work. So the third one is spill and leak prevention and response. I call this a two-sided coin. The first half is the hopeful side. Spill and leak prevention. In other words, let's keep things from ever leaking or ever spilling. Okay, and if you can, that's great. I know it's the facilities who haven't had a leak or spill they could talk about forever. Okay, But then reality sets in and response, because many times life happens. Something gets poked, something gets knocked over, unexpected things happen, and unexpected happens all the time. That's business, okay? So you try to prevent spills or leaks. You try to do what you can to prevent it. And so you develop procedures or controls to minimize spills or leaks. You do what you can. Okay. And you train folks how to appropriately prevent spills and leaks. You know, I've seen years ago, I've seen people who do things sloppily, and I've seen people who do things well. For example, I used to have an old client. They used to do armor for the military, but they're no longer in business. I guess after the Gulf War was over, they went out of business. But they used to have garnet, which is a sand and a water jet thing to cut metal. And what happened was they would take the garnet after it got really small and the water jets would no longer cut the metal, and they would muck out these giant vats and put it in these tipping hoppers, and they'd forklift it to an area outside their warehouse or the manufacturing building where they would store the garnet until it was hauled off. Okay. And that's a good thing because they had it was hemmed in, it was secondary containment, it was kept from leaving the property. That's good. Problem is they would fill the tipping hoppers all the way to the top, and then forklifts are not designed for comfort; they're designed for strength and for endurance. So they have no shock absorption. So they fill up these vats and then they drive it out to the garnet storage, and these things would bounce, and all this metal-laden garnet, sandy stuff would get all over the ground, and then their numbers were astronomical. And so spill or leak prevention, I was like, and this actually goes into material handling, which we'll talk about. So I'm kind of really giving you 2 for 1 here. I said, well, why don't you guys just fill it half full or fill it 2 3/4 full? Don't fill them all the way. They did that, and after that, their numbers vastly improved. Why? They prevented spills or leaks. So material handling and waste management, that's what we were just literally kind of same thing, talking about spill prevention. In this case, I was talking more about material handling. Now, here's where I can give you advice and things, but when it comes down to it, you are the expert. You know how your business works best. You know how things are. You determine, okay, how can I prevent or minimize the handling of industrial materials or waste that can readily mobilize content of stormwater during a storm event? So I know some facilities where they had 2 covered activities, but they were completely separated from each other. And then when they were done with one activity, they'd take the intermediate product over to where the other one was, and it was exposed to stormwater and had a lot of issues. And I said, well, looking at the process, I just made the recommendation, why don't you just move this one process from here and put it right next to the other process here, all undercover. Therefore, you don't have to expose yourself to all that stormwater. They did that and their numbers improved. It's just a real simple suggestion. But for the most part, you know your business. How can you do it? How can you handle stuff? How can you place things? It's like as a parent, if I have my kids, they put their cup on the table. Well, for whatever reason, kids have a tendency to put a cup on the edge of the table. As a parent, you know exactly what's going to happen. You know exactly what's going to happen. If that's sitting there, what's going to happen? Fall over. So as a matter of habit, as my kids are growing, whenever they put the cups down, one of the first things I would do is just grab and move it. Or I'll tell the kid if I was across, hey, put your cup on the table. It's right on the edge. And you're just preventing that cup from falling over and making a mess. Well, that's what we're talking about here. It's the same thing. What can we do to prevent things from making a mess? How can we avoid it? How can we handle what we have and minimize it? If you can cover waste disposal containers, you're supposed to. So here, this one here, the second one, it causes a lot of people heartburn because a lot of people have those giant 40-yard bins that are open and uncovered. And what the general permit says in 2015, and this hasn't changed since 2015, you're supposed to cover industrial waste disposal containers and industrial material storage containers that contain industrial materials when not in use. So they have these giant 40-yard bins. They put lots of material or lots of trash in it. And then at night when they close, they're no longer being used, right? But yet they have these big open bins. Rain would come and wash a bunch of, but they're not watertight. So the rain would come and basically wash out material out into the storm drain. And so the water board is saying, no, you need to cover those. And so that's why I noticed after 2015, a lot of businesses started getting the giant bins with the covers that they're built into them now. So you'll find that a lot of businesses now have those bins with the covers added to it. Erosion and sediment controls. This one was one that got a lot bigger under the 2015 permit than it was before, because most people think of erosion and sediment control as a construction permit thing, and that's true. A lot of it has erosion and sediment control. But also, I know facilities that, even though they're industrial, for example, I have a couple clients that supply materials for the construction industry. So they look like one giant ongoing construction site, when in reality, they're actually an industrial site supplying materials for the construction facilities. So what you need to do is you need to have effective wind and rain erosion control. So in other words, the wind or the rain doesn't just wash off stuff going down the storm drain. I know of a couple of facilities that have giant piles of sulfur, and they use walls or they use screens to help buffer where the prevailing wind's coming from, so it doesn't just blow the sulfur down the storm drain. Maintain effective perimeter controls and stabilize all site entrances and exits to sufficiently control discharges of erodible materials from discharging or being tracked off-site. So this is important because I have a client who wanted to get a NONA, a notice of non-applicability, because they have a nice big pond. But one of the things was they would drive off-site, and because they were supplying materials for construction sites, they had rattle traps and things to capture materials, but it's still tracked outside the property. And all the water board has to do, or anybody really, third parties, what you really got to watch out for, because they want your money. I'm sure they pretend that environment's important. Some of them really do. They do believe it. I know there are true people, but a lot of them, they can look and see, and just going on Google Earth, they can see where you're tracking out mud. So it's to your advantage to keep that clean. The whole point is, if you have they had a lot of mud instead of being tracked off their site, and so the water board denied their NONA, even though they may have had the capacity, because they were letting materials track outside. They got that under control. They got their NONA. Okay, so one, keep the storm drains clean. Two, people are watching, so it's important to keep things clean. Employee training program. Okay, so those who are here in this program, in this workshop, congratulations, you are fulfilling this general permit as we're talking. The general permit basically says you're required to properly, those who are going to deal with stormwater, you need to be properly trained. Okay. Now, here's the thing that added in 2015. In 2015, one of the things the general permit did was it established a program for what you would call QISP, Qualified Industrial Stormwater Practitioner. That's a person with my credentials. It created a credential program so that people who have experience in stormwater and have a knowledge of the general permit can help businesses. Okay, the QISP, or QISP as we call ourselves, are designed as a partnership with you to help you maintain compliance with general permit. Because remember, it went from this big to that big, and the water board knows people are needing help. I mean, they've seen people spend thousands of dollars on BMPs when a simple fix would have done it. Other people aren't doing anything, and they need to have help as how to approach it. So that's why they created the QISP program, or the QISP certification program, so they get people who are in the industry, people who've been around and know stormwater, and then studied and know this general permit and can get certified in it to help you with your processes. And as such, and with your compliance with the permit is what I'm trying to say. So what happened was, for example, we have levels 1, levels 2, which we'll talk about in the next program. But if you go to level 1 for an item that's over the targets, over the NELs, then you have to have a QISP help you with the reporting and getting that done. Why? Because they want to make sure that you're being helped by someone who should know what they're talking about. Okay. And we'll review ERAs and that in the next workshop. Quality assurance and paperwork is always important. Make sure that you do your paperwork, make sure that it's all done. Maintain your BMP records up to 5 years. So if you're inspected with the water board, but again, like I said, I keep mentioning the keyboard, but they talked about that in the keynote session we had yesterday about paperwork and about making sure your things are in order. Because one of the things they're going to look for when they come to your site is, are you doing your monitoring like you're supposed to? Okay, so they're going to look for that. Advanced BMPs. So those are the minimum BMPs. Okay, those are the mostly non-structural BMPs. Now let's talk about the structural advanced BMPs, what they're all about. One is exposure minimization. Exposure minimization includes things to prevent the contact of stormwater with industrial materials. Okay, roofs, storm resistant shelters, berms. Mostly though, it's stuff that covers. inside buildings, you're keeping exposure down. In fact, if you can do complete exposure minimization, you can get an NEC, and notice a no exposure certification. If you do everything undercover, including loading and unloading, which people forget that, if you have zero exposure to stormwater because all your industrial activities, you don't have any venting to your roofs, if you do everything undercover, you can qualify for a no exposure certification, and all you have to do basically is maintain that situation and recertify annually. In fact, that's coming up on October 1st. And you just pay a minimal fee annually. Again, make sure you maintain the NEC status, because if you start doing stuff outside, that you will be checked up on and you will be forced to get back into the permit. So just want to let you know. Stormwater containment and discharge reduction. They love this one a lot. Okay, this is great because we're going to get to something called treatment controls, and as of 2015, treatment controls have a very definite definition. Okay, before, people would put a pond in and say, look, I have a treatment control. It's a settling pond. It has some reeds and plants that help pull out pollutants. And to a certain extent, it's true, okay, because you're doing chemical, biological, or mechanical treatment of the water before it leaves. So there is a certain amount of treatment aspect to it. But many times people would put a little bit of that in, and it's really not enough to effectively treat the volume of water that's leaving their property. So the water board said, no, we need to have a standard where if you're going to call something an actual treatment control, you have to meet a certain standard. And the good news for you or I is we don't have to be the ones to figure out that standard. That would be done by an engineer, a civil engineer. So we let the civil engineers determine what it would take for us to meet that standard. So that way, if an engineer determines, well, if you build a pond this big, it'll meet that standard, then excellent. Then that way you have a professional engineer. In fact, the permit says it needs to be certified by a professional engineer. So let's just say, for example, a lot of my clients have ponds on their property. Long before 2015, they've been in stormwater for many, many years, since it started back in 1992. And they say, okay, well, I have a pond on my property. I don't think it meets that treatment standard, but I know I have a pond on my property. Do I have to now dig it deeper or dig it bigger to meet the treatment control standards? The answer is no. Okay. In fact, there's two things. One, if you don't have enough room to actually, if you never had one before and you need to build a pond, and you do, even if it doesn't meet the treatment standards, that's okay. In fact, the permit says we encourage you to do that. Why? Because some water containment and some water discharge reduction, like especially if you have a pond and some of the smaller storms don't leave your property, that's still a good thing. It helps water to go down on the water table, because our water table is being depleted because of all the usage. So it also keeps water from this runoff down the storm drain. You can have bio uptake from plants that help to remove pollutants out of the water. There's a lot of benefits to ponds and to vegetative swells, things to help water stay on your property and soak in rather than leave. Okay, so even if your facility doesn't meet the control standards, they use the word, we encourage you to do this, and it's a good thing. So I personally tell clients, if you can put a pond in, if you can put in a vegetative swell, if you could do something where water is captured and soaked into the ground, or if you can recapture water and put it back into a process. I had a former client that would capture the water and put it back into the process. Whatever works, as long as you keep the water from leaving the property, water board's happy with that. So they recommend you put something in. If you can make it reach that criteria of a treatment control, that's great. Now, once you get to level 2, you probably have to make it meet that control, because you have to do more. Remember, BAT, BCT, you have to do more. But initially, or especially after a level 1, if you put something in and it's working, then great. They recommend you do that. Treatment controls. Okay. Treatment control, as I mentioned earlier, is something that mechanically, chemically, or biologically treats stormwater. Okay. And for a BAP to be considered an actual treatment control as described or as labeled in this permit, you have to meet the standards that are outlined in Section X.H.1.f of the general permit. Okay. So it's in general is it has to meet an 85th percentile 24-hour storm criteria. Okay. And there's a whole lot into it. Again, the good news is you don't have to be an engineer. It just needs to have an engineer who can figure that out. So that BMP must be certified by a California licensed professional engineer, and they have that. And basically, the footnotes cites where they get their criteria from and what the engineers can do. So that's a really nice part. So we have a couple of engineers that we work with that are used to this and know how to apply this. And so not every civil engineer actually works with the treatment controls like this. So you want to make sure that if you do need to put a treatment control because you go to level 2, that you do get an engineer who does have a hydrology specialty and understands the rules that apply to the stormwater, to the general permit. Other advanced BMPs, okay? Other advanced BMPs, let me go back a little bit. Other advanced BMPs are things that don't quite meet the criteria as they put it in the general permit. For example, one of the things that we like to use are compost socks. They do a really good job of filtering. They do a good job of balancing pH a little bit sometimes. They do a good job of getting oil and grease. There are some where you can add materials to help absorb metals through ionic exchange. There's a lot of things that are positive for using compost materials. And so, for example, we have a client where we're doing a treatment system where it's a combination of peat moss and zeolite, and there's different things you can do to help clean the stormwater. So, but sometimes, especially when it comes to like socks or things, when you put them in place where it is treating the water, it is mechanically, biologically, it's treating the water, but it doesn't meet that 80th percentile 24-hour storm criteria that needs to be certified by an engineer. So those are the kind of BMPs you put in the other category, okay? So for example, we put a lot of socks in and they seem to work really well. A lot of people seem to have good results with that. The water board, especially regional board, they're very familiar with that type of BMP. Can you call it a treatment control? Well, in terms of the technicality of the general permit, no, you can't call it a treatment control. However, you can call it another category. And again, so we have, when it comes to the non-structural, or excuse me, to the advanced structural BMPs, you're supposed to apply them to the extent feasible. Okay, so that in general is the BMP requirements. So the first half, section 10 of the general permit, it says, here's a general permit. And then as you saw earlier, that we're only talking about 2 sections out of a vast permit. There's a lot more to the permit. That's why you have to have people with my credentials whose job it is to know this thing, because it is huge. I understand that. We're trying to help guide people into being able to comply with general permit. And your SWEP, your stormwater pollution prevention plan, is just a part of that. It tells, hey, here's the general permit, and here's how we plan to apply that. So I was wondering if we've reached the end of our this section, and I want to open it up for questions. Rebecca, do we have any questions from people?
There aren't any questions right now, but if you have a question for Aaron, go ahead and put it in the chat. Or you can unmute yourself and ask Aaron. And if you want to watch the recording of this, it will be up on our website within 24 to 48 hours. And if you want the presentation, go ahead and email. You can email me. I'm the coordinator. So email me at coordinator@stormwaterawareness.org, and we can send you the PDF version of Aaron's 3 presentations. Also, don't forget to register for part 2 and part 3 of this workshop. You're not going to want to miss it. And you can do that at stormwaterawareness.org. Is there any final questions before we close out this workshop?
Oh, and quick note, just as a help, I created a little certificate for people. So if they would like to get that from us along with that PDF, they're welcome to. That way you can say, hey, I saw the program. And I also created to where if you come back later, as Rebecca was saying so eloquently, and want to watch these workshops later, you can still get if you ask us for it, we'll send it to you. And we'll be happy to, you can get you that certificate, and then you can just document when it is you watch these. So that way you can meet that non-structural BMP, that employee training BMP.
Yes, and go ahead and email me, and we can get those certificates over to you after the event is done. Perfect. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions, so we're going to go ahead and close down this workshop so we can get ready for the next one. But like I was saying, I'm seeing some things pop up in the chat about certificates. So go ahead and email me at coordinator@stormwaterawareness.org and I can get those certificates over to you. But thank you, Aaron, for presenting, and we hope to see you all back for part 2.
Thank you all.